Leo Hartman's hands were covered in blue-gray paint when the Admiral walked onto the deck that morning in 1943. The mechanic didn't know his accidental mixture would save thousands of lives. He didn't know the strange, dull finish he'd created by spilling hydraulic fluid into regulation. Deck paint would make American planes vanish against the Pacific sky. He didn't know pilots were already whispering about the Phantom aircraft that enemy gunners couldn't track. All he knew was that he'd made a mistake, and mistakes in the Navy meant consequences. But as Commander Wesley approached with those test flight reports in his hand, one question burned in everyone's mind. Could one man's error become the weapon that turned the tide of the air war? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The USS Hornet rolled gently in the pre-dawn darkness as Leo Hartman made his way across the flight deck, his toolbox clanking against his hip with each step. The smell of salt water mixed with aviation fuel filled his lungs, a combination he'd grown to love during his 18 months serving as a ground mechanic in the Pacific Theater. At 24 years old, Leo had developed a reputation among the crew for being meticulous, almost obsessive about the condition of the aircraft under his care. His fellow mechanics often joked that he treated the Grumman fighters like they were his own children, inspecting every rivet, testing every control surface, ensuring each plane was as close to perfect as human hands could make it. The night shift had been particularly grueling. 3 fighters had returned from a patrol mission with minor damage, nothing catastrophic, but enough to keep Leo and his team working through the darkness. One plane had taken a few rounds through the tail section, another had a hydraulic leak that needed immediate attention, and the third had simply worn through its paint in several places from the constant exposure to salt spray and tropical sun. Paint maintenance might have seemed trivial to outsiders, but Leo understood its importance. The regulation blue-gray paint wasn't just for appearances. It provided crucial protection against corrosion in the harsh maritime environment and offered some degree of camouflage during daylight operations. As the first hints of orange began to paint the eastern horizon, Leo found himself standing before the 3rd fighter, a bucket of freshly mixed deck paint at his feet. The supply officer had handed him the paint just an hour earlier, apologizing for the delay in getting the proper aviation-grade coating. This substitute would have to do until the next resupply ship arrived. Leo had already prepped the worn areas, sanding them smooth and wiping away every trace of dust and oil. He prided himself on doing things right, even when exhaustion made his hands shake and his eyes burn from lack of sleep. He dipped his brush into the paint and frowned immediately. Something felt wrong. The consistency seemed off, thinner than usual, almost watery. Leo lifted the brush and watched the paint drip back into the bucket. It moved too quickly, lacking the thick, creamy texture he was accustomed to. He set down the brush and picked up the bucket, tilting it toward the dim work lights that illuminated the deck. The color looked right, that distinctive blue-gray that every Navy pilot would recognize. But there was an odd sheen to it, a kind of oily iridescence that caught the light in strange ways. A terrible realization crept over him as he noticed the puddle near his feet. During the hydraulic repair on the 2nd fighter, he'd been rushing, moving between tasks with the frantic energy of a man racing against the dawn. He'd set his paint bucket down near the hydraulic fluid reservoir he'd been working on. The container of hydraulic fluid had been open, sitting on a slight angle because of the deck's pitch. Leo's stomach twisted as he remembered bumping the toolbox. Remembered the small splash he'd heard, but ignored in his hurry to finish the job. He'd contaminated the paint. Hydraulic fluid had mixed with the carefully formulated deck coating, creating something that was neither one thing nor the other. The regulations were crystal clear about this sort of thing. Contaminated materials were to be disposed of immediately and properly. Using substandard or altered paint on Navy aircraft was a violation that could result in disciplinary action, possibly even a court-martial if it led to equipment failure. Leo stood there in the growing light, weighing his options. He could throw out the paint, request a new batch, and delay the plane's return to service. But that would mean explaining what happened, filling out incident reports, and facing questions about his competence. The alternative was to use the paint anyway, hope nobody noticed the slight difference in consistency, and get the plane back in rotation before the morning patrol launched. The exhaustion made his decision for him. Leo convinced himself that a little hydraulic fluid wouldn't fundamentally change the paint's properties. It might dry slightly differently, but it would still protect the metal, still provide the necessary coverage. He was too tired to face the paperwork, too proud to admit such a careless mistake. He picked up his brush and began to apply the contaminated mixture to the fighter's worn surfaces, working quickly to finish before the deck crew arrived for the morning briefing. The paint went on smoothly enough, perhaps even more smoothly than usual, thanks to the hydraulic fluid's thinning effect. But as it began to dry in the strengthening sunlight, Leo noticed something peculiar. The finish wasn't developing the normal semi-gloss sheen that regulation paint produced. Instead, it was drying to a flat, almost matte appearance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The color looked different too, not drastically, but noticeably. Where standard navy blue-gray had a slight coolness to it, this accidental mixture took on a warmer, almost neutral tone that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light. Leo stepped back and examined his work with growing unease. The painted sections stood out against the rest of the aircraft, not because they were a different color exactly, but because they had a different quality, a different relationship with light. He'd created a visible patch job, exactly what every mechanic was trained to avoid, but it was too late to undo it now. The paint was drying quickly in the tropical heat, and the morning air operations were about to begin. He would have to live with his mistake and hope that nobody looked too closely. Lieutenant Commander Richard Donovan was the first pilot to notice, though not in the way Leo had feared. Donovan was a veteran of 16 combat missions, a skilled aviator with an almost supernatural ability to spot enemy aircraft before anyone else in his squadron. He approached his assigned fighter that morning with the same pre-flight routine he'd performed dozens of times, walking around the aircraft, checking control surfaces, looking for anything out of place. When he reached the tail section, he stopped and stared at the freshly painted areas. "Hartman," he called out, gesturing for the mechanic to join him. Leo's heart sank as he jogged over, certain he was about to be dressed down for the shoddy paint job. But when he reached Donovan's side, the pilot wasn't angry. He was curious, running his hand over the matte finish and tilting his head to examine it from different angles. "What kind of paint is this?" Donovan asked. "It doesn't look like the usual stuff." Leo's mouth went dry. This was the moment where he could come clean, admit his mistake, face the consequences. But looking at Donovan's expression, he saw interest rather than disapproval. It's a new mixture," Leo heard himself say, the lie coming easier than expected. "Supply sent it up yesterday, said they were testing different formulations for better corrosion resistance." Donovan nodded slowly, still studying the paint. "It's got an odd finish to it, almost looks like it's drinking up the light." He straightened up and gave Leo a slight smile. "Well, if it keeps my bird flying, I'm not going to complain. Good work getting her ready." He climbed into the cockpit and began his instrument checks, dismissing the paint from his mind as he focused on the mission ahead. Leo watched Donovan's fighter launch that morning with a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. The lie had worked, at least for now, but he couldn't shake the image of that strange matte finish, the way it had looked so fundamentally different from every other painted surface on the carrier. He spent the rest of the day completing routine maintenance on other aircraft, trying to push the incident from his thoughts, trying to convince himself that nobody would ever know what he'd done. The fighters returned late that afternoon, and Leo was on deck to help with the recovery operations. Donovan's plane was among the last to land, touching down with the controlled precision that marked him as one of the squadron's best pilots. As the aircraft taxied to its parking position, Leo noticed something that made him pause. From certain angles, in the golden light of the late afternoon sun, the patch sections of paint seemed to blend almost seamlessly with the sky beyond. The matte finish created an effect he'd never seen before, a kind of visual softness that made the painted areas less distinct, less obviously present. 2 days later, the squadron flew an intercept mission against a group of Japanese bombers attempting to reach the carrier group. Donovan's fighter was part of the 6-plane formation that climbed to meet the threat. The combat was brief but intense, with American fighters tearing into the enemy formation from multiple angles. When the pilots returned and gathered for their debriefing, Donovan mentioned something that caught the squadron commander's attention. He'd noticed that during one particular attack run, when he'd positioned himself between the enemy bombers and the sun, their defensive gunners had seemed to lose track of him. He'd made 3 passes that should have drawn heavy fire, but the tracers had consistently aimed behind his aircraft, as if the gunners were firing at where they thought he should be, rather than where he actually was. Could have been luck, Donovan admitted during the debriefing. Could have been poor gunnery on their part. But I've flown enough missions to know when somebody has me in their sights, and today it felt like they were struggling to track me, like I was harder to see than usual. The squadron commander, a careful man named Wesley, who'd risen through the ranks by paying attention to details others missed, made a note of Donovan's observation. Over the next week, he began to notice a pattern. Pilots flying aircraft with sections painted in that odd matte finish reported similar experiences. Not every time, not in every lighting condition, but often enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Enemy fighters seemed to overshoot them during turning engagements. Anti-aircraft gunners aimed wide of the mark. The effect was subtle but measurable, and it showed up most prominently in harsh lighting conditions. When the sun was high or when aircraft were silhouetted against bright clouds. Commander Wesley was a man who believed in testing theories before acting on them. He called Leo to his office 3 weeks after that first paint job, and the mechanic arrived expecting the worst. But Wesley's expression was thoughtful, rather than angry, as he gestured for Leo to sit down. "I want to know about this new paint formula," Wesley said without preamble. "The supply officer tells me he has no record of sending up any experimental coatings, so either he's confused or someone's been telling stories." Leo felt the blood drain from his face. His hands gripped the arms of the chair as he struggled to decide whether to maintain the lie or confess everything. Wesley watched him with the patient gaze of a man who'd conducted enough interrogations to recognize the signs of internal conflict. "Let me make this easier for you, Hartman," Wesley continued, his voice not unkind. "Whatever the source of this paint, it's having an effect on our combat effectiveness. Pilots are coming back alive who might otherwise be dead. So I'm less interested in assigning blame than I am in understanding what you did and whether we can replicate it." The confession poured out of Leo then, the whole embarrassing story of exhaustion and carelessness, of spilled hydraulic fluid and contaminated paint, of the lie told to cover a mistake that had somehow become something more. Wesley listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When Leo finished, the commander sat back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. "How much hydraulic fluid?" Wesley finally asked. "Roughly what ratio to the paint?" Leo tried to remember, to reconstruct those pre-dawn moments when he'd been too tired to think clearly. "Maybe 1 part fluid to 8 or 9 parts paint," he said. "It was an accident, so I can't be precise. But the consistency changed noticeably, got thinner, and the sheen disappeared when it dried." Wesley nodded and made another note. "I want you to mix up several batches with different ratios. We're going to test this properly under controlled conditions. And Hartman," he looked up from his notes, "this conversation stays between us for now. If this works, if we can turn your mistake into something useful, you'll get credit where credit is due. But if it doesn't work, if I find out you've been cutting corners or endangering pilots, we'll revisit this talk under very different circumstances. Understood?" Over the next month, Leo became an unwitting chemist, mixing batch after batch of paint and hydraulic fluid in varying proportions, keeping meticulous records of each formula's properties. Wesley arranged for test panels to be painted and mounted on aircraft, positioned at different locations on the fuselage and wings. Pilots were asked to note which panels seemed most visible and which seemed to fade against different backgrounds. The testing was conducted quietly without drawing attention from higher command. Wesley wanted proof before he made any claims that might sound fantastic to officers who hadn't witnessed the effect firsthand. The optimal ratio turned out to be roughly 1 part hydraulic fluid to 7 parts paint, enough to dramatically reduce the finish's reflectivity without compromising its protective qualities or causing application problems. The resulting coating dried to a flat, neutral blue-gray that seemed to shift tone depending on ambient light conditions. In bright sunlight, it took on a slightly warmer cast that blended remarkably well with haze and glare. In overcast conditions, it cooled down and nearly disappeared against gray clouds. The effect wasn't true invisibility, nothing could achieve that, but it was a significant reduction in visual contrast, enough to give pilots a crucial fraction of a second advantage when enemy gunners were trying to lead their targets. By late 1943, word of the unusual paint had spread beyond the Hornet. Other carrier groups in the Pacific Fleet had heard rumors of a secret camouflage formula that made planes harder to hit. Wesley, now convinced of the coating's value, finally brought the matter to the attention of Admiral Halsey's staff. The presentation was met with skepticism at first. Senior officers had seen too many supposed wonder weapons and miracle solutions that failed to live up to their promises. But Wesley had prepared thoroughly. He brought combat action reports, statistical analyses showing reduced hit rates on aircraft painted with the formula, and testimony from pilots across multiple squadrons. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics dispatched a team of engineers to investigate. They arrived expecting to debunk what they assumed was another exaggerated field innovation, but their tests confirmed what the pilots had been reporting. The modified paint reduced specular reflection by nearly 70% compared to standard coatings. It scattered light in a way that broke up the aircraft's outline and made range estimation more difficult for observers. The hydraulic fluid, it turned out, was acting as a flatting agent, interfering with the paint's normal curing process and creating a microscopically rough surface that absorbed rather than reflected light. The engineers wanted to reformulate the coating using proper chemical additives to create a standardized product that could be manufactured at scale with consistent properties. But every attempt to replicate the effect with conventional flatting agents fell short. There was something about the specific interaction between the Navy's deck paint formulation and that particular grade of hydraulic fluid that created the ideal surface texture. After weeks of testing, the engineers reluctantly concluded that Leo's accidental mixture, refined through his trial and error testing, was actually superior to anything they could design from scratch. In early 1944, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive authorizing the production of what was officially designated as Sea Gray number 42. The formula was deceptively simple, 7-part standard. Navy blue-gray deck paint to 1 part. Type C hydraulic fluid, mixed thoroughly and applied in 2 coats for optimal coverage. Manufacturing facilities on the West Coast began producing the coating in large quantities, shipping it to carriers and land bases throughout the Pacific Theater. Painting crews had to be trained in the proper mixing ratios and application techniques. The paint dried faster than conventional coatings due to the hydraulic fluid content, which meant painters had to work more quickly to avoid lap marks and uneven coverage. Leo Hartman found himself promoted to Aviation Machinist's Mate First Class and assigned to the Bureau of Aeronautics facility in San Diego, where he served as a technical consultant on the Sea Gray 42 program. It was surreal for him, going from a mechanic trying to hide a mistake to an instructor teaching others how to replicate that same mistake under controlled conditions. He gave presentations to painting crews, answered questions about mixing procedures, and helped troubleshoot problems when units reported inconsistent results. The work was important, but also strange, building an entire technical infrastructure around something that had started with exhaustion and spilled fluid. He met pilots who credited the paint with saving their lives, men who'd flown through walls of anti-aircraft fire that should have shredded their aircraft but somehow missed. He read intelligence reports indicating that Japanese gunners had noted the difficulty in tracking American aircraft during certain atmospheric conditions. One captured enemy document specifically mentioned that American fighters seemed to shimmer and vanish when positioned between the gunner and the sun, an effect that perfectly described what Sea Gray 42 achieved under those exact circumstances. By mid-1944, virtually every carrier-based aircraft in the Pacific Fleet wore the distinctive flat blue-gray coating. The paint became so closely associated with American naval aviation that it showed up in Japanese recognition manuals as the identifying feature of U.S. carrier planes. Pilots developed tactics specifically designed to maximize the camouflage effect, using the sun and cloud layers to position themselves where the paint's visual disruption was most pronounced. Fighter squadrons reported measurable improvements in survival rates during the months after Sea Gray 42 became standard. The effect wasn't dramatic enough to change the course of individual battles, but over hundreds of sorties and thousands of combat encounters, it added up. Planes returned that might otherwise have been lost. Pilots survived who might otherwise have been killed. Leo struggled with the recognition that came with his accidental innovation. The Navy awarded him a commendation for his contribution to the war effort, and his name appeared in several internal reports about camouflage development. But he knew the truth, that he hadn't set out to invent anything, that his innovation had been born from carelessness and covered up with a lie. The fact that it had worked out well didn't change the fundamental dishonesty at the core of the story. He wrestled with whether to confess the full truth, to admit that Seagray 42 existed only because he'd been too tired and too proud to properly dispose of contaminated paint. He confided in Commander Wesley during one of the officers' visits to San Diego. Wesley listened to Leo's concerns with the same patient attention he'd shown during that first conversation in his office. "You're thinking about this wrong," Wesley said when Leo finished. "Yes, the initial mixture was an accident. Yes, you should have followed proper procedures. But recognizing that the paint looked different, testing different ratios, documenting the results, that was an accident. That was good scientific method applied by a mechanic who understood his craft well enough to see potential in a mistake." Wesley leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "I've been in the Navy for 22 years, Hartman. I've seen plenty of accidents, and most of them stay accidents because nobody has the sense or initiative to look closer. You turned an accident into an asset. That counts for something." He paused, then added, "The lie bothers you. I understand that. But here's how I see it. You told a small lie to cover a small mistake, and when that mistake turned out to be significant, you came clean and helped us understand it. You didn't keep lying. You didn't try to take credit beyond what you'd earned. In my book, that's good enough." The conversation didn't entirely resolve Leo's guilt, but it gave him a framework for living with it. He threw himself into the technical work of refining Seagray 42's application procedures, developing better mixing guidelines, and training painting crews to achieve consistent results. He corresponded with chemists who were studying the coating's properties, contributing his field observations to their theoretical understanding of how the paint interacted with light. He became, in effect, the world's leading expert on a coating that existed because he'd once been too exhausted to follow proper safety protocols. As the war progressed and American forces pushed closer to Japan, Seagray 42 went through several minor modifications. Chemists found ways to improve its adhesion and durability without sacrificing the crucial flat finish. Manufacturing processes were refined to ensure batch-to-batch consistency, but the core formula remained essentially unchanged from what Leo had created through trial and error on the Hornet's deck. 7 parts paint to 1 part hydraulic fluid, mixed thoroughly and applied with care. In the spring of 1945, Leo received a letter from Lieutenant Commander Donovan, the pilot who'd first noticed the strange paint job back in the summer of 1943. Donovan had survived the war, flying more than 40 combat missions without serious injury, and he wanted Leo to know that he considered Seagray 42 a significant factor in his survival. "I can't count the number of times I watched tracers pass just wide of my aircraft," Donovan wrote. "I can't prove the paint made the difference, but I believe it did. Whatever the story behind how you developed it, I'm grateful it exists." The letter arrived at a time when Leo was preparing to transition back to civilian life. The war was winding down, victory in the Pacific seemed assured, and the Navy was beginning to plan for demobilization. Leo had been offered a position with one of the paint manufacturers that produced Seagray 42, a job that would use his expertise and pay considerably better than military service. But he found himself hesitant to accept, uncertain whether he wanted to spend the rest of his life defined by an accident, even a productive one. He walked the San Diego waterfront one evening, watching carrier groups prepare for what everyone hoped would be the final campaigns of the war. The flight decks were crowded with aircraft painted in that distinctive flat blue-gray. Leo's accidental formula reproduced thousands of times over. He thought about the pilots climbing into those cockpits, men who trusted that every element of their aircraft had been designed and built to give them the best possible chance of survival. They didn't know that one of those elements, the paint that covered their planes, existed because a tired mechanic had spilled hydraulic fluid and lied about it. But Wesley had been right about one thing. The initial accident mattered less than what had come after. Leo had recognized that something was different about the paint. He'd tested it methodically. He'd documented his results. He'd worked with engineers to refine and standardize it. The contribution was real, even if the origin story was embarrassing. Thousands of aircraft had been painted with Seagray 42. Some unknown number of pilots had made it home because enemy gunners lost track of them for a crucial second. That outcome justified the messy path that had led to it. Leo accepted the job with the paint manufacturer and spent the next 3 decades working in industrial coatings, eventually rising to head their aerospace division. Seagray 42 remained in military service long after the war ended. Used on carrier aircraft through the Korean conflict and into the early jet age, it was finally phased out in the late 1950s as new aircraft designs and new tactical requirements made different camouflage schemes more appropriate. But for more than a decade, it had been the standard coating for American naval aviation, a formula born from exhaustion and accident that had been refined into something genuinely useful. In his retirement, Leo occasionally gave talks at naval history conferences, speaking about the technical development of aircraft camouflage during World War II. He always told the full story, including the spilled hydraulic fluid and the initial lie to cover his mistake. Audiences usually laughed at that part, seeing it as a humanizing detail in an otherwise technical presentation. But Leo never laughed. He remembered too clearly the weight of that decision, the sick feeling of watching Donovan's plane launch while knowing it carried evidence of his carelessness. He also told them about the letters he'd received over the years from pilots who'd flown aircraft painted with Seagray 42, men who wanted him to know they'd made it home. He kept those letters in a box in his study, dozens of them, each one a reminder that accidents could be redeemed, that mistakes could be transformed into something valuable if you had the courage to examine them honestly and the skill to understand what you'd created. Commander Wesley visited Leo once more, in 1968, when both men were long retired and the war had faded into history. They sat in Leo's backyard in San Diego, watching the sun set over the Pacific, and talked about how strange it was that a moment of carelessness on a carrier deck had rippled outward to affect thousands of lives. Wesley, now in his 70s and moving slowly, raised his glass in a toast. "To happy accidents," he said, "and to mechanics smart enough to recognize them." Leo raised his own glass but amended the toast. "To second chances," he said, "and to officers wise enough to grant them." They drank to that, 2 old men who'd been part of something larger than themselves, who'd seen how small decisions could cascade into significant consequences, who understood that the distance between a mistake and an innovation was sometimes just a matter of perspective and a willingness to look closely at what you'd done. Seagray, number 42, exists today primarily in museums and historical documents, samples of paint preserved as examples of World War II material culture. Aviation historians note it as an interesting footnote in the development of aircraft camouflage, a field innovation that temporarily gave American pilots a slight but meaningful advantage in visual detection. The full story of its origin, the exhausted mechanic and the spilled hydraulic fluid, has been told and retold in various forms, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the same essential truth. Leo Hartman died in 1987 at the age of 68, having lived long enough to see his accidental innovation become a small but permanent part of military history. His obituary in the San Diego newspaper mentioned his work on Seagray 42, describing him as an innovative thinker who'd contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific. His family, reading those words, thought about the countless times Leo had told them the real story, emphasizing the accident and the lie rather than the innovation. He'd never been entirely comfortable with the praise, never quite convinced that he deserved credit for something that had started as a mistake. But in the box of letters from pilots, carefully preserved and passed to his children, there was a different kind of verdict. These men didn't care whether Seagray 42 had been invented through careful research or stumbled upon by accident. They cared that it had worked, that it had given them a fractional advantage when fractions meant everything, that it had helped bring them home to their families. In the end, that was the only judgment that truly mattered, the assessment of the people whose lives had been touched by one mechanic's wrong paint that had somehow become exactly right.